Hello everyone and welcome to another loosely scripted editorial, and today I wanted to talk about Star Trek remasters and why they're so hard. Now, at the time of recording this video, Star Trek the original series, The Next Generation, Enterprise and all the modern shows all have Blu-ray releases. However, Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager only have DVD box sets available. And many Star Trek fans constantly ask why. Why haven't these shows been remastered like the original series and The Next Generation were? This video is basically my excuse to get really nerdy about film stuff and perhaps explain to those unfamiliar with exactly how a remastering works and why DS9 and Voyager are still only available in standard definition. So, before talking about the remastering process, I think it's worth explaining the original filming and broadcast process for these shows. I'm going to be using The Next Generation as the primary example here, as it's the same process, mostly, for Deep Space Nine and Voyager at the time. Obviously today everything is done digitally, episodes are shot with digital cameras and those files can be transferred onto a computer for editing, sound mixing, music, visual effects, etc. and then rendered out for the finished episode. And those finished episodes are then either put onto a drive or simply sent over the internet to whoever is broadcasting the show. However, for The Next Generation, the process was a lot more complicated. The Next Generation was shot in 35mm film, which produces a very high quality image, but the TVs of the day could only support standard definition. Also, the task of post-production with film negatives was quite an expensive one and time-consuming at the time, for TV anyway. And so to deliver the episodes on time, the TNG post-production team would take the film negatives and scan them into a computer to be edited on magnetic videotape. Once the edit was locked, the finished episode wouldn't be rendered, but printed onto a master tape, which would then be hand-delivered to whoever was broadcasting the episode. So onto the remastering process. What made remastering The Next Generation so difficult was that the finished episodes only existed as these standard definition videotapes. While the team did attempt a simple upscaling process, the results weren't really satisfactory. So instead they decided to do something truly ambitious. Find all of the original film negatives, rescan everything, and essentially rebuild the series in the edit from scratch. Now luckily Paramount Television had the negatives in storage somewhere for the team to use, therefore tracking down the footage wasn't much of a problem, just a very time-consuming one. Once the negatives were scanned into the computer, first the team went about cleaning up the film, as some were damaged, faded, or had dust and other artifacts on the image. Now there were a lot of these negatives, by the way. In the behind-the-scenes featurette on the Blu-ray, one of the editors said she had to go through over 200 reels of film per week, and in total I think the entire Next Generation show was about 25,000 reels of film. So now, once the negatives are scanned in, the process of matching the original edit and mixing the sound back in was, again, very time-consuming, but generally simple enough. However, when it came to the visual effects, everything became more difficult. Obviously, these days everything is done in a computer, but back in the day, models, opticals, and matte paintings were used. Now, this is probably something most people watching already know, but just to clarify, since the release of Star Wars, miniatures usually aren't shot in the same space together. Instead, they're shot separately on different pieces of film and then composited together using an optical printer to create the finished shot. So for The Next Generation, different elements of the Enterprise, the background of space, and whatever else had to be shot separately and then put together. However, as I mentioned before, for The Next Generation, this process was all done using videotape instead of an optical printer. So to get the visual effects shots up to standard, the team had to track down all of the film negatives for each individual element and recomposite all of the shots together. All in all, the remastering team had to track down, as I said, 25,000 reels of film, and the entire process took well over 2 years. However, even in the finished remaster, there were still reels missing, and therefore in certain episodes, the team had to resort to upscaling, and the difference is very apparent. In general though, the remaster of Star Trek The Next Generation is absolutely stunning, and I hope by describing the process a little bit you can start to understand why remastering Deep Space Nine and Voyager is not something Viacom CBS can just knock out over a weekend. This is a years-long process which potentially costs several $1 million. It's a huge undertaking. In fact, when it comes to Deep Space Nine and Voyager, the process becomes much more complicated because of their use of CGI. You see, The Next Generation used almost entirely filmed elements which the remaster team had to track down, scan, and clean up. They were essentially bringing out detail which was already there. With CGI, however, that's not the case. The visual effects team working on these shots knew the exact quality the finished episodes would be at the time. Therefore, most of the CGI shots for DS9 and Voyager were rendered out natively at standard definition, meaning there is no extra detail to pull out of the image. Because at the time, rendering out large, high-definition images of these shots would have added more time and money to the production for no real reason. Years later, however, this is what we're stuck with. Now, some would immediately ask, why not just remake the CG shots from scratch? To which I say, do you have any idea how much visual effects actually cost? This was feasible to do for a single scene for the What We Left Behind documentary, but for hundreds, if not thousands more shots, to modern standards, that's a lot of money. So, are there any other options? Well, yes. For one thing, upscaling has improved since the TNG remaster. Originally, upscaling just meant enlarging the image, but these days there's AI upscaling. If you have an image that's one size and simply enlarge it on screen, all you're really doing is matching an aspect ratio as opposed to actually improving the quality of the image. AI upscaling has remedied this a little though. AI upscaling basically uses a computer to add in extra pixels to a digital image so that when it's upscaled, you don't get that same loss of quality. Because there is no detail to pull out of the image, AI is used to try and add in the detail. This technology is actually used in a lot of TVs these days, you may not even notice it. However, the process isn't perfect. Some may have noticed in my recent Deep Space Nine retrospective how much more clearer the episodes looked. This is because the footage I used was from a fan remastering effort which used AI upscaling, and it's a pretty damn good job. Now, when placed next to the TNG remaster, it's not really a match, it's an improvement, but it's a long way off the quality of the TNG Blu-rays. Voyager also illustrates the limits of AI upscaling. For my Voyager retrospective, which I'm currently working on, I went to the same fan group to look at their Voyager remaster using the same technology, and the results are not good. This isn't to shit on the efforts of these fans, it's just that the existing Voyager footage is in simply too bad a shape for AI upscaling to be used as effectively as it was with Deep Space Nine. There's just not enough detail to create a truly good-looking high-def image. Instead, you get this weird kind of oil painting look. So I hope this puts into perspective why it's so difficult to remaster the older Star Trek shows. It's not simply a case of running some video files through some software, it's an entire pipeline which requires a lot of hardware, personnel, and money to complete. But maybe it's worth it? After all, Star Trek is a big, popular franchise. Surely the cost in remastering these shows would be offset by the people who would actually buy the Blu-rays, right? Unfortunately, it's a bit more complicated than that. Although DS9 and Voyager have their own passionate fan bases, the fact is they simply aren't as popular as TNG. The Next Generation was must-watch television during its run. The premiere and the finale were watched by tens of millions of people, and it's universally recognized within pop culture. As great as the other shows are, they don't have the same status. But there's another factor to consider, which is how the media landscape of today has changed. Back when the TNG Blu-rays were released, streaming wasn't so dominant, and physical media was the main way for people to re-watch their favourite shows. If you wanted to re-watch The Next Generation in its highest quality, you had to buy the Blu-rays. But that's not true anymore. So from Viacom CBS's point of view, would it really be worth spending so much time and money on a remaster if people are apparently already binging DS9 and Voyager on all these streaming platforms, despite them being in standard definition? Add to that the fact that these two shows simply aren't as popular as other Star Trek shows, and you start to see the problem. This is likely the reason why the long-awaited Babylon 5 remaster only got a release on HBO Max. It makes far more business sense to entice people to subscribe to your streaming platform to watch, rather than go to the effort of manufacturing physical discs and supplying them to stores. So I hope all this nerdiness has been either educational or a bit interesting. I still have my fingers crossed for a DS9 Voyager remaster one day, but I hope now you know why remastering Star Trek is not so easy a task as a lot of people think it is. Christopher Miller asks, will you be doing a retrospective on Star Wars like you've done with Star Trek? I'm afraid the answer to that is a no. I have made Star Wars videos in the past, but nobody ever watched them, so I decided not to focus on that. I'm also kind of out of the loop with Star Wars right now in general. As for a retrospective series on the movies though, I kind of feel like those movies have been covered in depth already. I can't really think of anything new which I would add to the conversation, so I'm afraid the answer is no. Ronald Ratcliffe asks, will you do a retrospective on the Stargate franchise? I feel like I've answered this question loads already. Yes, it's on the list. After I finish my Star Trek retrospective series, the next one I'm tackling is probably Babylon 5, but after that I'll get to Stargate eventually. Aston Bailey Fong asks, how do you come up with the topics for your videos? Honestly, it's just whatever springs to mind most of the time. Sometimes it's just a rant I want to make because I've seen a lot of people say something stupid. Sometimes I think I have a unique opinion, which may be interesting to some people. A lot of my topics actually start as Twitter threads, so maybe follow me on there to see how a lot of these ideas develop. Thank you for watching. If you like these videos, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on my new uploads. If you want to help the channel grow, join my patrons or my YouTube members, where you can see videos early as well as some other exclusive content. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.